All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just enter into some of the big questions that are raised by the moment that we are in now. So history is not about how everything has to be the way that it is now. Nevertheless, it would be naive not to notice that the way that we start thinking about history has to do with the predicaments and the questions that are raised by the present moment. You can't get away from the present moment, as you might have noticed. It's very hard to get away from the present moment. But what you can do is you can use the present moment to reflect, right? To reflect, and then when you've reflected, the history that you learn might make the present moment more comprehensible. So I'm not going to say that the purpose of this class is to make the Russian war against Ukraine make sense. What I am going to say, though, is that the war perhaps is an occasion for us to go back and understand this history. Some of the things which might seem mysterious, like how is a war like this possible, might seem less mysterious. Some of the claims that are made about the war might seem easier to dismiss or easier to understand once we have the history under our belts. So let me start with where we are. Where we are right now, it is what, the 31st of August or something like that? Where we are right now is that the Ukrainian armed forces are undertaking a limited offensive in the Kherson Oblast of Ukraine, which is right in the southern part of the country. Kherson, it's an interesting name. If you think about it, it doesn't actually, if you know anything about Slavic languages, it doesn't sound particularly Slavic, and that's because it's not. Kherson was named after an older ancient Greek settlement on the Crimean Peninsula. It was named by Catherine the Great when she founded the city. By the way, that ancient Greek city, which was also called Kherson, is now, the ruins of it are now in a suburb of Sevastopol, which is another city name which you might be hearing of. Things are exploding there at the moment. Sevastopol is part of the territory in the extreme south of Ukraine, in Crimea, which was occupied by Russia in 2014. So these place names, which seem exotic and mysterious, point us back to a history which is actually durable and comprehensible. So the Greeks are the oldest documented inhabitants of Ukraine. I'm not going to say the oldest inhabitants because there are the Scythians and there are all kinds of other people who left other kinds of traces. But in terms of continuous documentation of presence, the Greeks have been there for the longest, along with the Jews. So the Jews and the Greeks are the longest documented inhabitants of Ukraine, which suggests that familiar concepts of classical history, whether coming from a Greek side or coming from a Jewish side, are going to turn out to be useful in application to Ukraine. The history of Ukraine, as we're going to see, is about an axis of south to north. Okay, I realize I'm now getting into geography and like heads are spinning already. North is like, when you're looking at a map, it's the up one. I'm sorry. And south is the other way. But so when we think about, people talk about Ukraine in terms of east and west, and I just want to say that's a very recent phenomenon. The axis on which early Ukrainian history is going to emerge, or the history of Kievan Rus, which is the first big documented polity in this region, is it's a north-south axis. It has to do with Vikings, which is a major theme in European history, right? The Viking Age, which begins in the 8th century. It has to do with the encounter of the Vikings and the continuation of the Roman Empire, which is known as Byzantium, which is, capital in Constantinople, which is now Istanbul. Kievan Rus, our history, begins with an encounter of this major northern development and this major southern development, which meet in Kiev and set something off, which is in some way continuing. This something that is set off, we're going to be following for 1,000 years. The state which is founded, as I've said, is called Rus, or Kievan Rus. I'll talk about why it's called Rus later on. It's very interesting. But the territories in question are also going to be governed by other entities like the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, biggest state in Europe for quite a long time, Poland, the major power of the region for quite a long time, the Ottoman Empire, which we cannot forget. And if I get through the middle of this class and I haven't talked enough about the Ottomans, I want you guys to call me on it, because there's this whole thing about Kievan Rus, and like Putin talks about it, and Zelensky talks about it, and both Putin and Zelensky are named after the guy who was baptized, maybe, in order to found Kievan Rus, who was called Voldemar, because of course he was a Viking and not a Russian or Ukrainian, because Russian and Ukraine didn't exist at the time. But the Viking who got baptized, who was called Valdemar in 988, that name then becomes Volodymyr in Ukrainian and Vladimir in Russian, right? So that contemporary heads of state of these two countries are named after this figure who 1,000 years ago maybe converted to Christianity. But so there's this Kievan Rus business, and we're going to follow Kievan Rus, and it's fascinating. But we have to remember that the whole south of the territory that we're talking about was never actually part of Kievan Rus, right? So Putin is now making this war in Ukraine, and part of his logic, as I'm going to talk about, is that Russia and Ukraine have always been one people because a Viking maybe got baptized 1,000 years ago, which I want you guys to understand is not a persuasive historical argument, okay? If we get one thing out of this class, it's going to be that, like, if a dictator tells you that 1,000 years ago somebody got baptized, that doesn't mean your nation is the same as his nation. If we can, like, get through that, we'll have done a good job. So at least for the first 15 minutes of class. But my point is that we cannot forget that these southern territories were not part of Kievan Rus at all. Where the fighting is happening now was not, it was part of the ancient Greek world. It was part of the Ottoman world for a long time, but it was not actually part of Kievan Rus. Southern Ukraine has a different history, and it is brought into this larger Ukrainian thing later on. So I'm just saying that because we have to mark the Ottoman Empire, and we have to mark Islam. And in general, by the way, we have to mark Ukraine as a major center, not just of Christian history, because when you focus on Kiev and the conversion to Christianity, then you're in this kind of Christian teleological arc. You know, somebody maybe didn't get dunked in water, and therefore it's Christian forever. But Ukraine is actually a center of Muslim and Jewish and Christian civilization. And this is one of the things which makes it interesting and of note. And in the ancient period, it was a center of what you could think of as a contest between those three monotheistic traditions to convert the pagans who lived there, which we'll get to in a later lecture.